Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me immense pleasure to introduce this report, making a case for global workforce migration, a strategic blueprint to harness India's demographic dividend, co-authored by PwC and ORF. Uh, this is a critical landmark in the context of a research which talks about movement of labor from labor endowed economies to labor deficit economies. In fact, as you can make out that there are large parts of the global north which are turning out to be labor deficit, leading to decline in labor productivity, increase in dependency ratio, as also in fact increase in what we call in the context of the national transfer accounts life cycle deficits. So, given that if you can create a case for movement of workforce or and creating or converting this labor endowed system or workforce endowed system to human capital, creating a process by way of which, in fact, the workforce can be converted to human capital, doing adequate skill set mapping, and in the process, meet up with the demand that exists in the global north, it turns out to be a win win situation for both the recipient economies as also, in fact, the host economies from which the movement is happening. In one sense, it enhances labor productivity. In the second sense, it meets up the labor demand. In the third sense, it also addresses the critical employment question that exists in the labor endowed economy. So, with such a broad framework in mind, a case has been created on how India can embark on this path, especially in the context of workforce movement to economies like Japan, economies like the European Union, or even South Korea, where in fact the dependency ratio is increasing or has already increased over time. So, with these few words, in fact, I'd like to invite uh, Mr. Sanjeev Krishan, Chairman of PwC, and Mr. Jaiveer Singh, Vice Chairman of PwC Foundation, to launch this report.
I wanted to also have Mr. Krishnan to speak about the report. So,
I will possibly not talk about the third T here. The first two T's, as you can well imagine, are tariffs and technology. The third T, I'm sure there's a lot spoken about, so I won't speak about it here. But being an accountant, we always focus on the last 12 months. So trailing 12 months. So I'll replace the T with the M, which is the migration. Now, I grew up as a student of economics, and I always learned that it's got to do with competitive advantage of nations, and that should actually create wealth across the world, or at least solve the problems that the world has. Today, we are living in a world where migration may not be the nicest word around, and in some ways, having moved from an era of appreciating globalization to extreme nationalism and deglobalization, or a focus on nationalism, I think it's creating significant challenges in the minds of people who influence policy and take decisions about things on how things should happen in the future. Now, from an Indian standpoint, I mean, we of course celebrate our demographic dividend. We have 65% of our 1.4 billion citizens are in the working age cohort. And when it comes to anything, I mentioned the first two T's, particularly when it comes to anything on technology. We all know that the biggest SIs are based here. We are, of course, the workforce of the world, so as to speak. And even when it comes to areas like artificial intelligence, for instance, the skill penetration that we have is more than 3 times the global average. So there is a case for India to be leveraged even more significantly than ever before. Of course, programs like the Pradhan Mantri Kaushal Vikas Yojana, Skill Mission India, and Digital India have been providing further impetus. They have, of course, been supported by many bilateral agreements that we have done over the years, including the regulatory workforce deployment and structured agreements that we now have in place with UAE and Australia, and also the migration and mobility partnership agreement that we have with Australia, which provides global exposure for key industries, reinforcing India's ability to augment the labor supply chain. We also have negotiations ongoing with the European Union on talent partnerships, which aim to formalize a structured skill-based migration system that meets the demands of high-demand sectors. And we just heard when Mr. Ghosh spoke about certain countries like South Korea, Japan, indeed, Germany also is part of that. as to what is the skilling levels in those countries at this point in time and the impact on labor productivity because of the shifts in the working age population in these countries. In fact, by certain projections, by 2050, advanced economies will experience a shortfall of more than 400 million workers, is the estimate. Now, while a lot has been done, we do believe that there are a bunch of systemic challenges which continue to persist. And those are the ones that, for instance, the report addresses. These include stringent immigration policies, socio-political barriers, disparities in skilling infrastructure, of course, anti-immigration sentiments, bureaucratic obstacles, and lack of recognition of qualifications, which actually hinder the seamless migration of skilled workers. Now, what we intend to do, and what the report intends to do, is to really suggest certain areas by which these challenges could be overcome. I think the first thing that I'd like to suggest, or the report suggests rather, is that there is a need for a bit of a makeover. We keep talking about global labor migration. In the world of skilling, where skilling is possibly more important, should we be speaking about global skill migration as opposed to global labor migration? Because when you say that you will create value for the receiving party, then the experience is very, very differentiated. And I think that's one of the big things that can we delink the focus on labor and move the focus towards value creation for the recipient, and that we believe will be a huge enabler. I think the second one is simply the awareness that migration curves will lead to net economic losses for the global economy. It's a zero-sum game at the end of the day. There will be some losers, there will be some gainers in the interim, but eventually there will be global economic losses should we come in the way of significantly come in the way of what I would call migration curves. I just spoke about what the developed economies will have, the shortfall of workers, 400 million people possibly. If you look at the low-income countries, by the same period, 2050, there will be at least 2 billion new working age individuals. Again, the question would be, can we skill them and make them more productive in the parts of the world that need them the most? And I think that's a critical element which the report intends to address. The third one really is instilling workforce mobility. I think it's been fairly in India in particular has been at the front end of it. India's agreements with Germany for healthcare professionals and Japan's specified skilled worker visa programs exemplify this model. I think it possibly requires us to enter into bilateral negotiations, emphasizing the need for workforce adaptability and protection of their rights. And I think that's an important element because at times, and particularly when in many cases when people come back, how do they in fact come back and harmonize themselves within the societies that they went from is also a critical area. I think the other two pieces that I'd like to very briefly touch upon is, many parts of the world in at this point in time may not appreciate full-scale immigration. In which case, could there be offshore conclaves such as semi-autonomous labor zones, which can be in some ways many parts of the world are thinking about SEZs, special economic zones. They possibly also they can be complemented with semi-autonomous labor zones to make sure that we allow foreign workers to come in and create value for them. And in some ways, it can be a little bit more complementary than it is thought to be today. There could, of course, be the third model, which is the guest worker model, which offers really short-term employment to foreign workers. But I do want to talk about one of the things which is very close to us as an organization as well, and I'm sure very close to us as a nation. 60% of the global GCCs are in India, and I think that indeed proves the point that even if you don't want to necessarily focus on migration, you want to create value by having people in your domestic territory or in your homeland. And I think that sort of proves the point that you want leverage of talent, of skilling, but the only thing which prevents you from acknowledging the contribution that the skill makes is to have them in your respective countries. And I think there is no better example than the GCCs to be able to do so. Now, to be able to do these, we just want to propose 4 things because they require a certain amount of enablement. The first one really is a tiered migration strategy, which needs to be developed to address the distinct needs of skilled workers and focus on harmonizing the skilling ecosystem, which is as per international standards. Now, this would, of course, mean that in a world where we're talking about enhanced productivity and AI and so on and so forth, it is very important that we are able to skill ourselves adequately, and there has to be very significant and possibly an outsized focus on skilling and harmonizing how different people look at certifications and my educational qualifications, if I can be just candid. Second one is we talk about AI all the time, but can we use AI to actually have proactive demand generation strategies? I think that's the second one that we're talking about. There are a lot of bilateral and regional labor agreements which can actually come in and actually streamline the bureaucratic impediments, which are also an essential component. And I said that was one thing which actually prevented us from doing more. The third one is, and again I spoke about what happens when people go back. I think we also need to look at a national returnee policy, because many a times, particularly people who are there for a short term, they will come back to their home territories, and there is a need to make sure that there is a seamless transition of that workforce back in their territories. So in some cases, it will be a temporary or transient things, and we need to make sure that we can be a lot more seamless. For instance, the GCCs can be a big support area in that regard. I think the last one really is, and something that we have spoken about for a fairly long time. How can we extend the social security framework to include skill migration? We've been talking about gig workers for a very long time. There is obviously now the Code on Social Security 2020, which actually intends to, and a committee has been set up as well, which actually intends to provide them benefits which are similar to a regular worker. But I think more needs to be done to make sure that these people feel more comfortable, so that people are then more open to taking short-term engagements than ever before. We do believe that India is a big opportunity, not just for global businesses to create value for them in India through things like the GCCs, but also onboarding. And why just India? Maybe also many other parts of the world. I mean, you include places like Poland, for instance, where tech talent today is second to no one else. You include places like Philippines and others where talent has actually grown disproportionately, and all of those potentially have the ability to solve for the skilling needs that the developed world has. And I suppose, Terry, that's the task for you over the next 40 or 75 odd minutes to get from the panelists as to what do they feel about it.
So I want to introduce the panelists first. Starting from the far end, we have Maitri Das, the Director of Trust Funds and Partner Relationships in Development Finance at the World Bank. Then we have Kartik Muralidharan from the Tata Chancellor's Professor of Economics at University of California, San Diego. Then we have Ila Patnaik, the Chief Economist of Aditya Birla Group in India. We have Minister James Lawless, the Minister of Further and Higher Education, Research, Innovation and Sciences from Ireland. And we have Manish Sabharwal, the Executive Vice Chairman of Team Lease Services India. So I want to welcome everyone and thank you all for being here. I also want to give a thank you to ORF and to the Ministry for hosting us, and of course Team Raisina for making all of this possible. As a means of kind of setting the stage for this conversation, our topic today, migration, really ties together the threads of a lot of critical issues, from conflict and displacement to economic opportunities and aspirations to climate change and gender. It also has significant social and economic implications, as well as profound impacts on people and their lived experiences. Migration is really at the center of what it means to be human. People throughout history have always moved, and these flows have often instigated or become flashpoints. On my flight yesterday, when I was coming to Delhi, I had a short layover. And while I was, having a 1 hour layover, I quickly checked the headlines. And just at one moment in time, in one news source, I saw a series of stories that kind of illustrate the context of migration that we face today. One was that hundreds of domestic migrant workers from East Africa to Saudi Arabia have died at the hands of their employers in recent years. A professor at Brown University was denied re-entry into the United States and deported. And more than 200 Venezuelan migrants were deported from the United States and sent to prisons in El Salvador without due process and potentially against a federal court order. And the reason I bring all of this up is to just set the context. I think this illustrates the sort of profound moment of migration that we're in right now. So during this short 50-ish minute panel, I want us to do three things. The first is to acknowledge the contours of this moment for migration. The second is to try to tease out the ways in which migration is so important. You know, one of the things that we've lost recently in political discourse are the benefits of migration. So the discussions in public spaces tend to be dominated by the problems around immigration, and we have forgotten to discuss why it's so beneficial and how it can be beneficial to host communities, to sending communities, and also to migrants themselves. So I want us to kind of reclaim the discussion a little bit and articulate some of those benefits. And the third thing is to discuss how, in this moment and in this context, we can harness and support safe, regular, and dignified migration and discuss what it's going to take to bring that about. So I'm going to turn to you, Kartik, first. If you could briefly describe the global demographic transitions that are happening and sort of describe their implications for migration, and discuss how this relates to this core development objective of jobs, opportunities, and creating opportunities for people to pursue their aspirations. So Kartik, over to you, please.
It will be on. Perfect. So thanks for the organizers, thanks for the session, and thanks for the report. I think it's very timely. So, let me just, as the economics professor on the panel, just kind of reiterate something that the moderator just said. It is useful to reinforce that the research on migration is almost unambiguously positive, right? I mean, so study after study after study finds that, the economics of migration makes sense, right? It makes sense for the migrants, it makes sense for the host countries, it makes sense for the host employers. And the basic economics of this is the transaction happens because both sides want it, right? I mean, so the employer wants to hire somebody, the employee wants to work. So that's Econ 101, right? So if you didn't have borders, this wouldn't be a problem, right? It would just be a natural labor market transaction and everybody would be better off, okay? So it's useful to just go back and, just 2 days ago, I was having dinner with Michael Kramer, right, who won the Nobel Prize in 2019. And, he's done work, others have done work just documenting how guest worker programs are welfare increasing for everybody, right? So, and I think, and there's a reason I'm mentioning that because the high level punchline is very simple. The economics works, the politics does not, okay? And so part of the challenge is then how do we craft ways to get the economic benefits of migration while mitigating the political costs, right? So I think what we're seeing in this moment is it's very clear that there's a certain anxiety in receiving societies about the changing composition of their own demographics that then creates like massive backlash, and that is something that's real and that has to be acknowledged, right? So, but it's also true that just in terms of the numbers and the demographic kind of structure and aging, that most high-income countries simply do not have the workforce needed for geriatric care, right? Like, for their elderly population, okay? So this is just a fact, right? So the question is that's a fact. It's also a fact that countries like India are able to cater meaningfully, to the global good by being able to provide kind of talent that can meet that need. And we need to figure out ways of structuring this so that, you get the benefits and manage the costs. So I think, and maybe we'll come back to this in Q&A, but my overall kind of submission is that thoughtful guest worker programs, right, can be welfare enhancing across societies, and but the lead in some ways should almost come from the recipient societies, because this should not be something that is pushed by the society sending the staff. It's really because it has to be demand driven, right? People saying, I have this need, I need to cater to this. And what I would love to see more on the Indian side as somebody who works on education and skilling and training, there's a huge opportunity, and there's this old school, and think about healthcare workers, right? You'll every once in a while get this concern about, brain drain, like, our kind of talented, trained kind of folks working. And that's like a really misguided way of thinking about it, because it assumes that the pool is constant, right? So the research is again very clear that there's no greater way to improve the skilling, like, rather than having kind of a pipeline where they get to kind of go work in a high return setting. So I think the mantra we should be following, and frankly, I would prefer to just focus on healthcare, where the needs are the greatest everywhere in the world. And it should just be like learn, earn, and return. Okay, so building skilling programs in India with a pipeline that says this is what it's going to take you to get credentialed to be able to provide, say, geriatric care in a high-income society. And so there's a certain training pipeline that gets you there. And then you have a short-term kind of migrant visa where you go do this for 3 years, you earn, you save, and then you're also returning. And then that return is incredibly beneficial to India as well, because instead of brain drain, what you get is brain circulation. Okay, so I'll pause my opening remarks there and then, take up more in Q&A.
Thank you, Kartik. And thank you for sort of highlighting some of those benefits at the outset. That's great. And also for bringing up one of the key issues that we have, right, which is the politicization of migration and the political challenges that we face in making it work well. We know that the economics work, but the political part is still a challenge. So I want to turn to you, Minister Lawless. How can some of these political challenges that Kartik just mentioned in receiving countries specifically be addressed? Like what is it going to take to sort of start to get at some of those issues? And maybe you can also outline what some of those particular challenges are.
The discussion today. So I think the first thing that's important, as you said, Terry, is to acknowledge the moment and to take a stock of where we're at. And sometimes we wonder, is this a bump in the road or is it actually a fork in the journey, or are we actually going a different direction? When you said about stop off in Dubai on the layover on the way here, I thought you were going to say that because I had to check my phone to see the rules of the system when I landed in Dubai, were they still the same when I landed in Delhi? Because we are at a time of change and rapid change and turns and U-turns and new emergencies. So that is a huge volatility. I think risk is not good for the state or the economy or even society. If we know the rules, we can follow them. If we don't know, if we have uncertainty and if we have change, it can be a challenge to grasp with. But we've huge change. We have extraordinary times. We've been through the pandemic globally. We have multiple wars. We've accelerated climate change. And then we have changing socioeconomic trends as well. So we're very much in this uncertain time. I'm going to share some thoughts maybe from the Irish experience of migration. And I think Ireland is a country who has experience in both directions. So we've had significant levels of historic emigration, but we also have in more recent years very sustained immigration. And I listened to Kartik speak about the brain circulation. I think that's a really interesting point. So I'm going to talk about brain distribution, perhaps. So one of the strengths, I think, of the Irish experience has been that we had emigration for the wrong reasons, because of famine, because of poverty, because of colonialization, from the 1850s, 1840s, up into maybe the 1980s. But that actually, there's an asset in that, there's a strength in that, which is the Irish diaspora around the world. So we have friends in many, many countries, and they are part of the Irish network, and there are many millions more Irish people, including Irish citizens, passport holders, globally than there actually are in the country itself. So that can be a strength, because I often hear the fear about brain drain, but actually this brain distribution, and that can become an asset. There can be investment decisions and policy decisions made, leaving on the strength of that connection. And the other point I would make in terms of maybe more recent experience is that many of the skilled workers that leave Ireland to go to other countries for training or for life experience or for just I suppose as young people just to travel, very often return home with an enhanced skill set. So people go and study postgraduate, further professional training, and come home with and bring those skills to bear. And that is, I think, I think it's reverse migration is what we talk about. And then on the flip side of that, the more political challenge is migration that we've seen in recent years. And Ireland has gone from being a troubled country in terms economically to being a really successful country. But we don't take that for granted. But we have enjoyed a couple of decades of rapid economic growth. We're doing extremely well. Our economy has profited. So we're now a country that people come to live in. And I think I would distinguish between what I would call crisis migration and gradual migration. So crisis migration, we saw, for example, with the war in Europe, we had 100,000 Ukrainian refugees came to Ireland in the space of a few months. And that was a crisis. And that was a crisis for the people who were fleeing. But it was also a crisis in Ireland to accommodate and manage resources. And questions were legitimately asked by host communities saying, well, if there's a shortage of medical services or school places or leisure, even just public amenities, and all these new people are coming so quickly. And one of the ways I think we manage that is through communication, engagement, consultation. And consultation is difficult because it's not saying, do you agree? But it's saying, how do you think we should do this? I have to say the experience has been largely positive with Ukrainian arrivals because there's been an understanding of what's happening and why they're there. But that is a challenge, and it isn't easy. And I think it is so important that the host communities, and I think, again, a lot of this goes back to inequality, because you have inequality, you'll have unrest. And if people feel disadvantaged, and maybe they're in an area that's left behind, whether that's in Ireland or in Ukraine or in India, they will then maybe resent the new person coming in. So I think it goes back to, I'm a big believer in a rising tide lifts all boats. So if we can invest in, my belief is the medium of education. If we can invest in across society at every level, bring everybody up, then resentment begins to fade, and actually people have a better understanding, and then we have a more successful integration. So perhaps some thoughts for starters.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you so much for that. Manish, I want to turn to you. As India's leading human resources and human capital expert, can you talk a little bit about how India can leverage migration to meet its development goals? What role does and can potentially migration play in development in India?
I mean, there's no such thing as poor people. There are people in poor places, right? And there are 3 physical places and 3 conceptual places. So the 3 physical places are which country you're in, which state you're in, and which city you're in, right? My parents live in UP, I live in Karnataka. Both states have the same GDP, but Karnataka does it with 1/5 the number of people than UP. So clearly people in Karnataka are more. Which city you live in? I mean, if everybody in India lived in Bangalore, then India's GDP would be more than China, right? India's GDP is 2,500, ours in Bangalore is 12,500. So clearly anybody who moves there. So, but this sort of a plumber from Odisha moves to Lucknow and gets 2 times wage premium, moves from Lucknow to Bangalore, gets 4 times, moves to Dubai, gets 8 times, and moves to Zurich, gets 25 times. It's the same damn plumber without any skill development or language training, right? Because it's so I think that's really important to recognize that the physical places are important, but also the 3 conceptual places. Which sector do you work in? IT is, we all love IT, but it's 0.8% of India's labor force, but it generates 8% of GDP, while farming is 44% of our labor force and generates 14% of GDP. And obviously, which firm you're in, there's a 24 times difference in productivity between our biggest and smaller firms, and which skill you work in. And of course, you don't have, so an important question for India is also domestic migration. And this is an issue which is becoming big because we're a country of 1.3 billion people. But we don't have to migrate to harness some of these advantages of migration. India exported more software than Saudi Arabia did oil in 2021. Every American eats 5 made in India pills every day. Right, we sent 200 billion pills to the US last year. The Americans eat 400 billion pills. 200 billion of those were made by India. So we didn't have to migrate to do that. But for India, this, in addition to getting our own act together, just as a more fertile habitat for job creation, that's independent of this migration one. I think this migration one for India is a unique opportunity because of the Indian brand, because of more people speak English in India than they do in America, many things. So the 13 million diaspora in India should and will go to 30 million. So our remittances will go from 120 billion inward remittances to from 120 billion to 300 billion. So that is a plan that hopefully we are working on. And now what are the constraints? And this is a particularly, I think, if there was a global workforce made in India, I mean, it's really an Indian opportunity more than an opportunity for other people for various reasons. One is the Indian brand with offshoring, right? I mean, I was checking in Minneapolis a few weeks ago, and the frustrated, very nice young lady at at the airline counter when she was struggling with it. She said, "Why don't you send us more Indians and fix our computer systems?" I don't think she would be saying that about Pakistan or Bangladesh or Syrians and stuff like that. I'm not being racist here. I'm just being clinical as somebody who runs a people supply chain company. And I'd love to hear your comments on when you said that you welcomed 100,000 Ukrainians. Would they have welcomed 100,000 people from Africa? Cultural adjacent, look like you, white people. So these are all important questions when I think clinically as a people supply chain company, because there are only three variables for me. There's demand, supply, and there's matching, right? And you said Econ 101, which is, it's clear that Econ 101 works, but the demand is really the politics of it. And I think illegal migration is killing legal migration, which is why we were the first to accept illegal migrants back. It's part of our overall sort of brand. We say, okay, we'll take them back if you want us to. Some other countries are not. And we're not really sure, at least from our perspective. Now, she asked me as a people supply chain company, I would not really say, but take away their path to citizenship. Maybe you have to separate path to citizenship from the work, and then it becomes a lot more easier for people to accept or talk about the real issues rather, because the real issue is path to citizenship and illegal migration. And India is aligned with that. Now, on the supply side, I think this is not the binding constraint for us. We have enough people. I mean, even in the biggest models that we want to raise, it's 13 million going to 30 million. And so that's not a kind of constraint for us. But will the economics trump the politics in some sense? I mean, I don't think in the short run economics will trump the politics. On the matching side, we have got our act together on skill development in some things. We're encouraging a lot of international certifications. In fact, we may have more people internationally certified than are getting the opportunities because of visas, particularly in nurses now. America hasn't given a new nurse a visa for the last 6 months. Many other countries are, and they're giving some to Philippines, but to Indians they're not. So, but we've already certified these nurses on the US thing. So I would submit that from a pure plumbing perspective, the matching is the binding constraint. Will we get visas? I think we'll figure out the skill stuff. I think we'll figure out the protection stuff. But there is demand, there is supply, but the matching is broken, and I can dive into matching again.
Yeah, thank you for that. When you mentioned cutting the pathways to citizenship, the first question that comes to my mind is for who? Because those pathways are going to exist for some migrants, but not for others. And I think that matters. And it also gets to the point that you mentioned about immigration to Europe, who's being welcomed and who isn't. I think that's going to be a relevant discussion in terms of who's getting pathways to citizenship and who's only able to come for short periods of time. I want to turn it to Maitri, though, because you brought up some of the internal migration stuff, which is obviously a super important part of this conversation. Maitri, given sort of the politics and the difficulties of international migration, especially at this moment, does internal migration offer an alternative for countries like India? And does internal migration face some of the similar kinds of political backlash? Is movement within also difficult?
Thank you very much, Terry, and thanks to ORF for this invitation. I do want to start by responding to something Karthik said. What are you doing? Development finance, why are you on this panel? So I'll tell you why I'm on this panel is because I'm a demographer. And it's, I think, in that capacity that I'm on this panel. He didn't ask it quite like that, but yes. So Terry, to respond to something that you asked on internal migration, it's not an either or. Okay, it's they are very similar and two very distinct kinds of migrations, and not just in India. Whether you take China, you take Nigeria, you take any of the large countries, internal migration is a big part, and yet not big enough. So it is only 10% of the Indian workforce is migrant workforce. So people who migrated in the last 1 year for economic reasons was only 7%. And that's an interesting quandary, okay? Because the narrative around internal migration is very similar to the narrative around international migration, which is that that we want to have enough, so the brain drain stuff, whether you want to have rural areas that have jobs enough, that are self-sufficient enough. So the push factor shouldn't be the driver, it should be the pull factor that's the driver for migration. And yet you see people, there have been traditional migration routes within India. There have been traditional migration routes across different parts of the world internally. In most countries, this is unregulated. In China, it is regulated through the hukou system. The one in India is unregulated, and I'll give you the example of what is happening. And this is very anecdotal because one of my pet peeves is that data on migration is severely limited. And since India hasn't had a census in 2021, we still go back to the 2011 data for India, but there have been smaller scale surveys. Not even enough qualitative work that gives us a sense of the migration patterns that are taking place internally. And I'll give you one example. So I'm from Jaipur, okay? I'm very, very connected to Jaipur. Jaipur, over the last 15 years, has become a hub for geriatric care, something that you mentioned. This is a huge demand in India. Okay? Even though the population above 65 currently is only about 7% of the population, it's going to double, and in absolute numbers, by 2030, it's going to be a huge population. So even now, you have the need for geriatric care, and this is one area, one industry, if you will. If it was more formalized, it would be an industry. But currently, it is geriatric care. Most of it is home-based. So you have many hubs that have emerged: Bangalore, Pune, Coimbatore, to some extent Bhubaneswar as well. But Jaipur has become a major hub. And I'll give you a story of how migration has really been, I want to say, numbed in the geriatric care industry in Jaipur. Typically, Rajasthani women don't work in other people's homes. Okay, they work on fields, they work on construction sites, they don't work on other people's homes. So who comes in? Who does the domestic work? It is women from Bengal, from Kuch Bihar. Why is that? Because the migration route from Kuch Bihar was set by Maharani Gayatri Devi, who was the princess of Kuch Bihar. And so this was a historical migration route, and women from Kuch Bihar had basically monopoly over domestic work in Jaipur. And then the geriatric hub came to be. And when the geriatric hub came to be, just before COVID, but particularly during COVID, wages for geriatric care absolutely went berserk in terms of they went very high. So wages rose for, this is unskilled labor, okay? This is unskilled labor that becomes semi-skilled labor just on the job training. It becomes semi-skilled labor. It's pretty much unregulated, but it could be semi-regulated with, agencies sprouting up here and there. What ended up happening as a result of an increase in wages, because reservation wage rose, is that Rajasthani women came in. And so Bengali women who have historically been doing this work now became domestic workers, cooks, but not geriatric care workers. And over time, wages have increased so much that Rajasthani men have entered the geriatric care industry, which they had done. So this is just to say that, I am not in favor of huge amount of regulation of migration, especially internal migration. I am in favor of having a data-driven approach to migration and leaving well alone a little bit. And yet, the need for more skilled workers in the geriatric care industry, the need for a certain number of protections for these, for the workers, but also protections for the geriatric persons that are being cared for. So there needs to be some kind of a framework for geriatric care in India, because this is going to be a growing, burgeoning industry. And I think that this is an area where I'm hoping, I'm sure Manish has already thought about this, but this is an area where, in terms of leading to better jobs, or as ILO calls it, more and decent jobs, I think this opportunity definitely is very rife right now. So stop there.
Thank you for that, Maitri. That's, a really interesting and illustrative example of kind of the role of internal migration and those shifts that are happening because of many different factors coming together. I want to turn to Ila. I guess from a private sector perspective, can you kind of trace out a little bit and discuss why it is that immigration is so important for firms, not just in India, but everywhere? I mean, what role does immigration play in firms being able to meet the need for workers? And specifically, sort of, how does the anti-immigrant sentiment that we're experiencing now affect companies, if at all?
Thank you, Terry. I think I want to begin with just making one point where I agree with everybody else that what we're seeing now is something temporary. I mean, you look at the last, 5,000 years, maybe 10,000 years. The world won't be what it is if people had not migrated. Human beings have moved from one place to another all the time, all these years. And whether it was for work, whether it was for search for food, whether it was for the weather, whether it was for water. So it's very, very important to remember that what we are seeing now in the last 100 years, and maybe we'll see it for another 100 or maybe 50 years, not more than that. It's a temporary phenomena where we've divided the world into countries and where we stop people from coming in because we don't want to give them welfare or we don't want to give them jobs. But we actually want them to come in because, as you said earlier, all research has shown that migration is a win-win. It's a win-win for everyone who is involved ultimately, and it's the politics that stands in the way. In particular, today, the age profiles of different countries, and we've already talked about that India is at a huge advantage. By 2040, half the world's working age population is going to be in India. Now, how are the other countries going to cope? That's my question. India, yes, we have an excess supply situation, so we'll want our workers to be trained to go abroad, so that they can find meaningful, productive work. But it is also that other countries, firms in other countries, should be easily able to hire these workers. In addition to that, I think a lot of the focus, and especially thinking about it from the point of view of the private sector and firms, a lot of the focus has been on the domestic countries, say India, trying to skill its workforce, trying to send them here, there, or, as we've trained nurses for the US or wherever they should be going. It's been focused on the supply side rather than the demand side. I think in the next 10 years, as it becomes very clear that people need workers to be coming from India, it is those countries, and some have already taken that initiative. So we see programs with Japan, for example. Some have already taken this initiative, that they are the ones who come in here. They are the ones who say, okay, we need nurses or geriatric care workers or something else. We will provide the loans, education loans. We will provide the visas. We will provide the rights of workers. And we want young, warm bodies to come to our countries because they need them. So from the point of view of the private sector, which is, the question you asked me, it is important that governments recognize this. They recognize that over the next few years, there are shortages. They don't have the skills, or they don't have, and wherever that is. I mean, like the UK today craves for the Polish workers that they sent away. They did what they did when they thought at that moment that was something they didn't need. But, today, along with the workers, the companies, the skilled manpower, the tech firms have moved away from the UK to Poland. Now, don't let yourself get into that situation where you think that, the politics is so important that you don't have to worry about how it's going to, roll out in maybe 10, 20 years. Have longer time horizons. So that's what I would look for. Other countries, governments coming in with programs so that companies like ours, who are actually, our group is present in 22 countries, and we hire people from there as well as from India, so that we are able to do that hiring easily. We're able to take workers with skills. Thanks.
Thank you for that. I just wanted to pick up 2 points that you mentioned. I mean, thank you for highlighting, the fact that people migrate for many reasons. I think we haven't really brought that up, but I mean, we're talking a lot about labor migration in this panel, but there's many, many reasons that people move, and I think it's important to acknowledge that because people move to be with their family, they move because they have to and they've been displaced, and I think, for the purposes of this panel, I think labor migration makes a lot of sense, but we do need to situate that in a broader discussion of people move for many, many reasons, and people, as you rightly said, have always throughout history moved. And I think it's important to sort of have that kind of context. And the second thing is, I like the reframing that you've offered, that it's really the supply side factors, and it's the receiving countries that really need to maybe drive this, that it shouldn't necessarily be India that has to be spending lots of resources and time thinking about how to skill its workers to send them overseas, but maybe it's countries like Germany that need healthcare workers or other things that need to be thinking about this, because it's really not India's problem per se, but potentially it's really the problem for countries with shrinking workforces, and that kind of slight reframe may be really useful for us. So thank you for that. Yes, Manish, please.
What gives you the confidence that this is temporary? Just history? I mean, do people in rich countries, are they voting against their self-interest when they're voting against migration, when they're voting to close borders or to do? Are you saying they don't know what's good for them?
So I think it is where, the rate of time preference. Okay, if I may answer as an economist.
What's that say?
They basically prefer today too much to the future. So they discount the future too much. And when people discount the future too much, it is actually the role of the government to be going above that and trying to not discount the future that much, because it's like air pollution. What we are doing today, we're merrily polluting, not worrying about how it's affecting the next generation, which can barely, our children can barely breathe. Or it is about a lot about what we are doing in terms of sustainability and greening. And why is it, same reason, why is it today that we cannot bring down global temperatures? Why is it that we keep arguing about per capita or total CO2 emission that we do? After all of us are going to be affected. But there are countries that are not signing up, that are not agreeing. So it's the same, effectively the same. It's not about not voting against their self-interest, but their present narrow, myopic self-interest.
And I think it gets to the point that you just made about the short time horizon for planning, right? When we think about things in the next 5 years and the next 10 years, maybe that's not a long enough time horizon to be thinking about it. And another thing that I just want to bring up is the research also shows, right, that there isn't necessarily a huge sort of shift that's permanent towards anti-immigrant sentiments, that throughout history it has waxed and waned. And so perhaps we need to think in the longer term, not that this is going to be a constant and forever, but that maybe we will have another period of where immigration is being more politically palpable across societies. Minister, I want to turn to you now. One of the challenges that international migrants face when they arrive in receiving countries is that there's a lack of recognition or acknowledgement of their qualifications. And this can be a major challenge, especially for displaced populations, but for other migrants as well, who may be, the best surgeons in their countries, and they end up in their host country working in much lower scaled work. And that obviously has negative consequences for the migrants themselves, but also for the country where they are migrating to. So do you have any insights about the ways that we can think about and address some of these issues?
Sure. So thank you. Just on the point about what voters vote for, as someone who has stood for election 5 times, I actually take the point that I think both of you are correct, actually, because I think that sometimes voters want something, an instant reward, and people, it's natural human behavior. It's economics 101 perhaps as well. You want what's in front of you today, not what might be in front of you tomorrow. And governments struggle with a number of things, not just migration, also infrastructure, big projects, big expenditure, because any government that wants to give you something really good in 20 years' time has to get elected in 20 months' time. That is the challenge for, I think, governments the world over. So that is the problem. So I think that's if anyone knows the answer, tell me afterwards how we manage that. But in terms of I think you're right about the skill set. And I suppose in Ireland, how we address that, we have a qualifications body, and we have invested a lot of work into mutual recognition. So even in the course of my trade mission here this week, I've been meeting with my Indian counterparts and discussing the mutual recognition that we can do in terms of what a certain level of qualification is, what standards are required, how many years in a particular course, how many proficiencies you must have, and I suppose international agreements on skills recognition and skills requirements, and then the different, I suppose, tiers, level 1, level 2, level right up to level 12 type qualifications, and having that mutual recognition. And that promotes flow between countries, it promotes successful migration. One of the points, I think, coming back to the discussion about the global uncertainty and the time of change, I think one of the strengths of a highly skilled workforce is that it is more difficult to take an activity out of that economy. So if you have an activity which is high value and up the value chain and it's quite specialist, whether that's put together with the local education system or through targeted skilled migration where you're actually actively seeking workers of a particular type, once that is there, it is quite sticky. So it actually is embedded in the fabric of the local economy and maybe the national economy. And that is actually more resilient and robust at a time of change with tariffs and all kinds of different trade rules. It's much harder to lift a facility with really high skilled labour, staffing it, and move it somewhere else, to flip it somewhere else. Whereas perhaps if you're lower down the value chain, it can be easier to replicate in another place. So that's, again, I suppose another reason why key to a lot of this argument is education, a skills mix. And then the other point, I think it was Manish was talking about, I think you put it very well, illegal immigration is killing legal migration. I think that's exactly right. I think there's a responsibility on us as governments as well to match the skills gap so that, again, it's economics 101. It's entirely predictable that if there's not an easy path to an economic advancement, that people will find a way around. They will come under another path, whether that's illegal or whether that's coming in under some other guise. So we have to respond by saying, well, there's a skills gap, we have a skills need, and here's an accelerated visa program to get there, and actually match the worker with the position, and not have people doing entirely predictable and rational behaviour, which is circumventing rules to get to the end, going from A to Z when they could go from A to B if we structure it correctly. So I think there's an onus on policymakers to assess the system and see are people making entirely predictable journeys, and can we actually anticipate that better and actually provide a better framework for that to happen in a way that benefits all.
Thank you. I want to pick up the thread that you mentioned about people voting against their interests, and others can feel free to respond to this as well. I mean, how much do you see it as an issue that immigration and migration are often blamed for issues that they do not cause? So, for example, it may be that, housing shortages and crime and all of these things are blamed on immigrants, and people are voting for that, but when someone comes to power, and those issues are not resolved because you're addressing immigration or irregular immigration, I mean, how much do you think that sort of plays a role in the politics of it?
Yeah, sure. So I think that is exactly right. I think that sometimes immigrants can be scapegoated as well, and people can say, well, it's all the new people's fault, it's the others' fault because we don't have the services that we need, we don't have the housing that we need. And I suppose it's the job of the system to explain that actually these people are part of the solution, not part of the problem, because this is actually maybe our construction skills shortage or IT skills shortage, or actually in Ireland, you mentioned the Indian workers would be asked to come and fix the computer. In Ireland, they would be thanked for their healthcare providers as well as the computer work, because there's such a high number of Indian professionals working in our healthcare system, and there's actually great awareness and I think gratitude, because most people have had a family member treated in a hospital. Very often it's an Indian national that looks after them. But it is challenging, the piece around and it's particularly challenging in an age of disinformation and an age in which we have so much propaganda being spread so easily and by bad actors online and bad actors politically who are utilising those tools. The trite way to answer that is say that good actors must put good information up, but that's much more difficult to do. It's much more challenging, and there's an old saying in politics, when you're explaining, you're losing, and a lot of us are doing a lot of explaining at the moment, and it's difficult for the centre to hold, I think, in that context. So that is a challenge. I'd like to think we're managing it. Certainly in Ireland we have kept the, I suppose, protest movement at bay. We had recently had our general election. There was no sort of far right or anti-immigrant activists elected to parliament. They don't have any representation. There's a small number in a couple of councils, but I think sometimes we can misinterpret the noise they make, particularly in online fora, for electoral support. They can be extremely noisy, they can be extremely nasty, and they can be very venomous, but that actually belies their small support base. And I think it's when we go to the polls that is put to the ultimate test, and thankfully they failed that test in Ireland at any rate.
In Ireland, yes. Does anyone else want to pick up that thread? Kartik, I feel like you have something to say.
Yeah, I just want to say something to connect something Manish said and Maitreyi said. And, and highlight why this is an opportunity for India, even if we don't send a large number of migrants, right? So the thing Manish said is we have the supply and we've got the credentialed nurses and we're waiting for the openings. What Maitreyi said was we've got this growing industry, but with very limited kind of training and quality standards, right? So I think there's scope for integrating this in terms of having a well-tiered skilling kind of strategy that says, if you're certified for the global market, then the Indian market will also give you a wage premium because you're certified at a level that has much higher standards. So, the example I give, I kind of asked my undergrads in my class on the Indian economy. So when we talk about the role of just exports, right? When you think of which was the most important American company for Chinese development, what do you think is the answer? So most people don't get this right. They'll think about a company that invested in China, but it turns out the most important American company for Chinese development was Walmart, okay? And that's because they were sourcing from thousands of companies. And so by kind of setting quality standards of what those companies had to meet to be able to export, they helped raise the standards for the entire ecosystem of suppliers, right? So I think that's a useful analogy to keep in mind as to why even a small segment, right, that's able to migrate can then set the returns and the standards so that you're able to improve skilling all the way down the ecosystem. And so then if there's companies like Teamlease or others that then specialize in saying, we will kind of create the pipeline of trained kind of staff who can access these opportunities when they exist. But regardless of the waxing and waning of that demand, that will have huge spillover benefits in India. So that's something that, it makes sense for us to cater to regardless. And obviously, the more numbers of candidates who are able to access those opportunities, the higher those returns will become. But just wanted to connect those two threads because it allows us to use the standards of exporting, right, to basically upskill and improve kind of the overall, the domestic ecosystem. And I think that's a huge win. And particularly for health, something that we should be acting on.
Thank you. Maitreyi. Maitreyi first, and then I'll turn.
So quick one, I wanted to say two things. One, that the competition for services and the competition for jobs, real or perceived, between receiving communities and migrants is real. Okay, that whether it's perceived or it's actual, there's a real competition for schools, parks, parking spaces. Yeah. It's a real thing in Switzerland. So I think that's real, and that drives a lot of the politics. So that's actually real. The second thing I wanted to say was that there are actually good examples for where this has worked. So Ireland, for sure. Jordan, Syrian refugees in Jordan. In Nigeria, refugees from the DRC. These are all examples of where host communities have actually had a planned approach. And why have they had that? Because there's one thread that runs through all of these, and that's a social contract. There's a very strong social contract among these countries and among these hosting areas. Ireland is a great example of the social contract that has stayed through the centuries. And when that happens, it's a much easier way of getting to migration, of managing migration. To give final example, in China, it is precisely to prevent this competition for services to become larger than life and unmanageable that the hukou system was put in place. So I think that there are many ways in which migration has been managed and can be managed, but this whole idea of the perception of migrants, it's there in Jaipur. It's there, it's the Rajasthanis versus Bengalis. It's real. Okay.
Maitri, thank you so much for that, and thank you for bringing up the social contract. I've been waiting for that to come up. Minister Lawless, I will come back to you on the social contract, but first, Ila, you had something to say.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to and agree with what Karthik said. And this is in the context of the GCCs. So today, India's service exports are exceeding goods exports. So, and a lot of what is happening is the GCCs. And there are people who are getting trained on the jobs, learning on the job, and they're basically working for foreign companies. But at some point, many of them start, taking on roles. So they worked here, then they take on roles abroad, and that's kind of, the same process happening. But as we reach the limits of what can be done, one is as we reach the limits of what can be done remotely in terms of service exports, the same people are now ready and skilled and start migrating. And that's happening in a lot of, whether it's in accounting, consulting, legal services, in technology, in cybersecurity, in many spaces. So just wanted to add that.
Yeah, thank you for adding that. Minister, the social contract. Can you, I'm glad that Maitri brought that up. Can you kind of elaborate on that a little bit? I mean, what role do you think the social contract and kind of maybe even an extension to that sort of economic security in general for a host population? I mean, how can those be achieved or what's needed to do that? And what role do you see that playing in facilitating sort of a more productive migration?
Sure. So I think there's another way to put that is that at a time of economic growth, there is very little pushback on immigration. At a time of economic recession, a downturn, people begin to look over their shoulders and look at their neighbours and look who else is new to town. I think in terms of the social contract, the idea that if we obey the rules, if we follow the legal system, if we participate in democracy, then we will be enabled to be an economic actor, to be cared for and have our public services met. But I think the most important, there's one word that for me is the most important for any economy and society, and that's aspiration. That people must be able to dream that they can better themselves, better their families. And I suppose the social contract, to my mind, is that you work hard, you study hard, you get a good career, and then you can fulfill your own ambitions and provide for yourself and your family. So if we can't do that, I think the social contract starts to break down. And if people see, be it migrants being a barrier, or there might be domestic issues, even perhaps a housing shortage, lack of available jobs, lack of education, those kind of things can begin to challenge the social contract. And that's when we begin to see unrest. But I do think that we also have a mismatch that we have times, say, where we have high employment, and sometimes we see people who are agitating about migration, saying they're taking our jobs. But actually, the people making noise don't actually want a job. And there's a great saying, the best, I was saying to Eli before the program, the best welfare program is a job, actually, because that is, where we have our success for the economy, which leads into success for society, because the private enterprise creates the public good, creates the resources to actually put into all the other programs. So again, it goes back to what I said a few moments ago about a rising tide lifting all boats. But it is so important that we keep trust with the people as well. And that's why, again, go back to information. And it's important to be positive, but actually be accurate and truthful with people. So if we're saying to people there's, a migration challenge, or there's people coming in for different reasons, we must be very honest and open and transparent, and also prepared to have to take the questions and hit the counter challenge and respond to that, I think, in a measured way. I think any good democracy that can manage that transition, if you can maintain the trust of the people, because if you try to paint a pretty picture that people actually know is not real, or they see actually deteriorating within a couple of years, that's going to lead to a gradual erosion of democracy. So I think that it's through honest, accurate information, maintaining the social contract, and ensuring that public services are not compromised. I think if you can get that right, and I'm not saying that we always do, but any society that aims towards that will be better placed to match these challenges.
Could I ask a follow-up?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Do you think a social contract is possible in rich countries with heterogeneous populations and with aging populations? Much of what Angela Merkel said has not aged well, but one thing has. She said Europe is 7% of the world's population, 25% of the world's GDP, and 52% of the world's social spending. This is unsustainable. This European model is a myth. You can't finance it, and you can't finance it with aging, and you can't finance it. And the more homogeneous the population goes, we know that it's hard to create public goods with heterogeneous populations. So social contracts are public. So this myth of social contract, I mean, we should just end it, right? In rich countries, not here.
I think if we just end it, then we really will have breakdown. And I think we're not going to roll back the Enlightenment and say that we have pool or sovereignty with the state as the Leviathan that's going to govern us in return, and we have to have that kind of mutual. That is the social contract. But I think you're right. I think that some of the challenges we talk about, so the pensions time up, that you know, the many kind of Western societies have the growing pool of workers who are expected to retire, and you know, we've seen this already in many large industries worldwide with defined benefit pensions being you know, seriously challenged, sometimes not being viable anymore, moving to defined contribution models. But I suppose there has to be change in those societies as well. So that's why we see debates in Ireland and in France and in other countries about retirement age. The dream that you will get to maybe 60 and retire is not really viable anymore. You know, it's an ongoing conversation in Ireland. I think it's 66, 67 now. It's going to keep being pushed out. So there has to be a reality check as well. And that has to take account of changing demographics, you know, changing longevity in that case. But that is, I think, yes. So, but I listened actually, you were saying about agriculture. I think it's 44% of Indian activity, but only 8% of GDP. It's the same idea, you know. So some sectors create more economic value, create more GDP than others. But perhaps there's ways we can use technology to bring all sectors along to increase to spread the assets more and actually get more productivity. And productivity is something that's often missed in these discussions as well. That we need to have a productive workforce and a productive system, and to be more agile and be more responsive to change overall.
Thank you for that. I saw a statistic recently, and I wish I remembered exactly what it was, but it was something like every 100 or 200,000 international migrants that we have in the United States makes the Social Security or our pension system 0.8, almost 1% more secure. So, I mean, there's one idea that immigrants, right, aren't contributing to Social Security, to pensions, to health insurance schemes, but actually they're often contributing huge amounts to that. And that is essential for the social contract and also social well-being overall. But Manish, I want to turn to you again. So I'll do it in 2 minutes, a quick one. So in terms of the social contract and kind of, you mentioned the idea of the short-term migration, right? As this temporary short-term migration. The minister just mentioned that jobs are really one of the key things to ensuring people's well-being, economic security. It's also the way that people tend to get access to social protections is through jobs, proper jobs. But temporary migrants often don't have the same kind of job titles or opportunities to contribute to or be a part of those social welfare schemes in the same way that citizens do. I mean, do you, in that sense, feel like there's a gap in temporary migration as providing economic security and well-being for migrant workers?
I'm not sure I understood the question.
So you mentioned temporary migration as a potential solution, as a really good model, right? But temporary migrants often don't have the same kind of access to social welfare programs that full-time, local workers do. So do you see that as a potential problem if workers are just getting jobs and wages, but they're not getting the kind of social protections that other workers would get?
I mean, back to my social security sustainability. You know, he talked about honesty, so we have to be clear about how much social security employers can provide. You know, in a world where, cost to companies, in the old world, salaries were one thing and benefits were one thing. In the new world, benefits come out of salary. There's no difference anymore. So the notion that benefits are over and above salary or benefits, if the government wants to finance benefits, we're happy. But their debt to GDP ratios are reaching. So I think as long as we give the wage premium, see, my view is it's a 8 times wage premium or a 25 times wage premium, and you're upfront being told about the contract. So the notion that a guest worker program is a path to migration is probably is mis-selling the product. If you want to offer people path to migration, you're welcome to do that. But a guest worker program is not meant to offer a path to migration. Now, if you're worried about can we protect them during the time, well, social security is not offering protection. It's offering other forms. We do need to protect people. So I would be careful with positioning this lack of social security as a reason to not have a temporary migration. In fact, if you say that they will be fully loaded onto the system, they haven't paid into the system, so how can they benefit from it?
I guess my point is that even temporary workers who are native workers often don't have the same kind of access to social welfare programs. And so I'm just asking, if a job isn't just a source of income, but it's also a source of protections, and I don't mean physical protections, I mean access to things like paid leave, sick leave, unemployment, all of those things that people need to live a secure life. Temporary migrants most likely, and in many cases, do not have access to those. They get wages, but they don't get those things. So I'm just kind of teasing out this difference. If we want migrants to be temporary and short term, they might be getting wages, but not something else.
Just to come in briefly on that, I think, go back to the social contract, and so we have our older workers in more settled societies who are receiving pensions and maybe more generous benefits because the system has changed. And I think it's correct that really wages is now equal. The benefits are part of the wage in many ways. If the benefits are higher, maybe the wages are lower. So there's been a realization there. But actually, it's the migrants that are paying the pensions of the retired workers. It's the new workers that are here actually that are actually doing that. So they're playing their part of the social contract. And once they're plugged into the system and they're paying their taxes and working on the books, then they're actually doing that. So they're fulfilling the retirement dreams of the older workers, and then you hope that the cycle repeats again. With each generation that keeps on happening. So that's actually an example of how migration keeps the societies going, and actually is a really positive, because they're the net contributors when everybody else is actually on the beach. They're the ones that are actually coming, same as every generation before it. So that is part of the answer, I think.
Thank you for that. Workers are also contributing, right? But they aren't necessarily gaining the same benefits, is the point I was trying to make. So we have just a few minutes left, and I want to open it up to the audience for questions. So I think what we'll do is we'll take 2 to 3 questions. If you could just very, very briefly introduce yourself and direct your question at one of the panelists, and make it a brief question and not really a statement, but a question would be ideal. So please just raise your hand and I'll call on 2 or 3. Okay.
So I'll be brief. Navita Shrikant. I'm an investigator, and I did do, labor investigations in UAE, and heard this interesting conversation about social contracts. So what I do want to leave on the table, that it's really for the supplying country to negotiate the best bilateral, safeguards, because I've seen in investigations how Thailand and Philippines negotiated the best safeguards as compared to countries from South Asia, be it Bangladesh, India, Nepal, Sri Lanka. You could really see the plight of the workers, but not such safeguards. But Thailand, Philippines, really many more safeguards. So that's something take away back. And I do want to compliment really ORF and PwC for this fantastic, it's really a start, we need it. But I do want us as India to act bigger, and we have a larger role to play in the region. That, I work on India-Nepal relations, and especially Nepal. And, I'm talking of a country where 30% of GDP is remittances, and 2,000 Nepalis leaving every day. So these are really demographic dividend region, and India must take up the larger role and lead it for the region, because migration is sans border.
Do you have a question for any of the panelists?
No, so
okay.
One was
no
more
okay.
comments.
All right, let me see the next. Here.
Thank you. Thank you, Terry. My name is Udaybir Das. Just want to get the panel's reactions to 2 observations. So we have heard about crisis-induced migration. We have heard about migration on account of economic considerations. Any views on climate-induced migration trends, which are now becoming very much, it has to be a part of the framework. That's one. The second is that I've always struggled with this one. From a policy point of view, should India be following policies pushing out labor, or should it be following policies of keeping in labor? Because India's policies India's needs for labor are going to go up and are going up dramatically. So whenever this thing comes up that we have so much of excess and we will feed the world and what have you, I've always had this question, what about us?
Okay, thank you for that point. That's a very valid question. And anyone can feel free to take that up in just a moment. I want to take one more question before we turn to the panelists. There's one in the back.
Good afternoon, I'm Sindhuja. Moving apart from demographic transition, I just want to talk about one basic thing about Indian education. So just 3 points, and I wanted to hear your views on that, ma'am. The state government in Telangana is spending rupees 1.25 lakh on each government student. And the student pupil ratio is 16:1. Yet, nearly half of class 8 students in Andhra Pradesh and Telangana cannot read a class 2 text. So when we are talking about skilling and other aspects, how do we look at basic education, like basic fundamental and numerical literacy?
Thank you. That's a great question. Okay. Does anyone on the panel want to respond to any of those, or should I take a few more? Okay, I think Maitri has a response, and then I'll turn it. Oh, you don't. Okay, sorry. Kartik, you have a response?
Yeah, it felt like somebody saw me in the panel and decided to ask an education question. No, so let me answer Uday's question and answer yours together. See, when you say what about us, it's actually a very interesting one, right? Because at one level, it appears like we have almost in a classic Lewis model an unlimited supply of labor. On another level, every employer is struggling to find skilled employees, right? So where is that mismatch? And I think that's exactly, we have an abundance of labor, we have a shortage of skilled labor, right? And so skills in every meaningful way, right? So L&T can't find civil engineers, like, we can't find, enough high quality nurses. So the way I see this is, whether it's for India or for the world, the most important thing is how do you upskill everyone, right? And so, like I mentioned, I see this business of being, the analogy of exports, I think, is exactly right? Which is, when you have companies that are good enough to export, it also benefits the domestic economy by raising the standards of quality and production, right? So think about this labor migration opportunity exactly the same way. It's what raises the returns to education. See, who produced most of our IT engineers? They weren't produced by the IITs, right? It was NIT and Aptech and these guys who came and responded to the global demand. And that's what raised the entire skilling level in the IT ecosystem, right? So what the global demand does is essentially boost the skill for the whole domestic population. So that's why I'm never worried about wanting to keep people back. I think you skill everybody, and then people who leave and then who remit will that's part of the returns. And then they may come back, they don't come back, then they're part of the distributed brain distribution like the minister was talking about, and many of them will come back. And I think, so coming back to how can you do skilling when school education is so weak, Manish has said, I have said many times that the best skilling program is a better school education program. But I think another way to think about this is that education improvements have happened. So Land Pritchard famously says, right? He says demand and supply matter as much for outcomes as gin and tonic for getting you drunk. Okay, so it's like basically it's the demand, right? So when the market demands the skills, the supply will emerge. Okay, so there's a separate issue that the public production is inefficient, but that's we'll have to take that offline. Right?
Thank you so much. Does anyone else want to pick up any of the questions or comments that we heard? Yes, please, Minister.
Yeah, just very briefly, I think the point about climate migration is a very important one, but I think it's already happening, because I think that most of the crisis migration, some of it is war, but also it's drought, it's famine, it's disease, and we're seeing that happening across the world already. And I think that also goes to the points made earlier about domestic migration. So it doesn't have to be cross borders. We would see within countries people moving from areas of being repelled by the sea, for example, with rising sea levels, moving to urban areas. And that's going to pose a challenge on services in those urban areas as well. So I think we're actually already seeing that that is actually taking place. But you're absolutely right. It's a key part of the mix.
Thank you. I know there's probably many other questions, but we have run short on time for today's session. So I just want to thank Sanjeev for the excellent presentation and for sharing this report with all of us. And I want to thank our panelists for all of your thoughts and your insights. This was a really, fun panel, and I think we covered a lot of ground. So thank you to our panelists, and of course, thank you to the audience.
Thank you so much, Terry, and thank you all to the audience members.